Good morning. It is 11 a.m. on the dot. Today is February 24th, and you are listening to the live feed of the Indigified podcast, sponsored by Great Plains Action Society, right here on KWTN 100.9 FN, Allen, Nebraska, the Big Voice Radio, official radio station of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. As always, all opinions shared are not a reflection of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, the Big Voice radio station, or the Great Plains Action Society.
Hi, Neepy.
Hi, Neepy.
Good morning. Good morning. So today we're going to be talking about Black History Month. It is the month of February. It's coming to an end. So, of course, we'll talk about it in our own Indigified way. And I think it's going to be a really great conversation. So
yes,
I'm excited about it. Very informative. So
Absolutely.
I feel good about it. But before we dive in, how is everybody doing? How has your week been?
Good morning. My week's been very action-packed filled, with class and the snow and work. But just getting through everything. And how are you guys doing today?
Well, I am let me start out by this. No, I've been having a really good week. I don't know, for some reason I felt like I was stuck. I don't know if anybody else has felt that this week, but I just couldn't get out of this rut feeling, because I have so many projects that I'm working on, and right. I don't know if it's just all at once just coming at me. But I mean, overall, I'm really thankful, and I guess it's with all these projects that we're doing, and then just in general, I think that I haven't seen necessarily the big bang, if you will. Mm-hmm. But I know that we're steadily working towards that, and it's just it's always going to be a slow climb to get to those goals.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so that's where I'm at. I'm just okay, I just got to keep focused. I got to keep, just hustling and grinding and working hard. And yeah.
Remain patient.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think with that, it just goes with the balance, balancing the time, balancing the energy, balancing the effort. And I personally believe that, we can't expect too many unrealistic expectations in our affairs. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that you brought that up, though, because like I said, for me, it's just simple, action-packed week, but you was able to go more in depth with that. So thank you. How you doing, Monica?
Yeah. I'm doing good. I'm tired. I'm so tired. I also have a lot of projects going on. I've got a pretty big opportunity this evening. I don't want to say too much about it, right? Because I was raised, you don't celebrate your wins until you actually win, because somebody could be listening who doesn't want you to win.
That's true.
So,
That's true.
So hopefully next week I'll have some good news and get to share my experience from tonight.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you guys know. My small circle knows. So that has been really hectic, organizing all of my thoughts, organizing everything that goes into it. Mentally I'm great. I feel really good. I think I'm also kind of in an autopilot mode where I'm not necessarily just surviving, because I'm not in any turmoil or, negative spirits, but definitely an autopilot. I just gotta go and go and go. Yes, and once I'm finished, then I can take a moment to rest. Of course, I grab my little moments when there is times like these where I can reground myself and make time for the things that I love and the things that I enjoy, the things that make me happy. But lately it's been okay, I got 10 minutes for some self-love. What am I going to do?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. But I'm happy everybody's doing well. I'm happy everybody's had a great week. So, kind of something new that I've been wanting to do on the podcast is an icebreaker.
Okay.
And since we're getting into the topic of Black History Month, I would love to know your guys' favorite, like, historian or current African American person that, like, influences you or motivates you or you just vibe with.
I'll go first. So growing up in like a white household, if you will, I don't know, like Tupac was one of the game changers for me, I guess.
Okay.
And just like growing up, because I mean, I wasn't exposed to that necessarily. So I think I scared my dad when I started listening to like, you know, Black music, if you will. But it, again, you know, just sharing my story from last week, that was something that I resonated with. And as I got older, I knew that I was different from, you know, just my neighborhood, if you will. And I don't know how it came to be as far as me wanting to listen to Tupac, but everything that he had talked about just resonated with me. Mm-hmm. I honestly don't know where that came from, but again, just talking about, you know, the struggles of the Black community. I think too, like as I got older, you know, those were my friends, you know, essentially I had Black friends and, you know, I was most comfortable with them. And that's just, you know, I guess it came with that, as far as like the Black music and having Tupac as, you know, someone to, you know, he's a real model, not necessarily a role model. I call him a real model.
Okay.
Because, because I mean,
break
like,
that down.
right?
Chop that up for us so we can digest that. You know,
you know, because I mean, not everything that he did was perfect, but also like he did shed light on a lot of the struggles within the Black communities all over. And
Absolutely.
I think also too, just talking about the cultural aspect of, you know, the motherland, you know, in reference to Africa. And, you know, so that was kind of the first Black American, if you will, that influenced me and, you know, just kind of shaped my upbringing, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm happy. Like, I love that you picked him because when I think of Tupac, I think of like the beginning of modern activism because he wasn't like organizing, you know, these speeches or these riots. He was reaching like our younger generations, not necessarily like children per se, but like young adults. He was reaching them through music and providing like this knowledge of what was going on in the communities that he grew up in, but also he provided it in that Black Panther way. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Coming from parents who were Black Panthers, who were active members of the Black Panther Party, the way that he gave it to us was real. You're a real model. Yeah. So, yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I just always loved Tupac and his message. And again, yes, it wasn't necessarily the political engagement that he was going for. He was just speaking about his life and his life experiences, right, and just giving it to us uncut and real, you know? So I love that. I love when people can really sit down and look you in the eye and say, this is what my life has been like, and these are the social struggles. And yeah, so I love Tupac.
Absolutely.
Period.
He was very relatable from coming from poverty and turning that into something with his acting and his passion for just life, you know. For me, trying to get my phone open, I would have to say my one of my heroes growing up would have to be Muhammad Ali. You know, it's not so much because he was a champion, he was the greatest, you know, boxer by his own declaration. For me, it was more so of what he did outside of the ring, as far as denying the draft.
Yes.
You know, and I have a thing here. I was doing some research on it, you know, looking up on his Wikipedia from Google. And it says here that when he was notified of his status to be drafted, Ali declared that he would refuse to serve in the army and publicly considered himself a conscientious objector. Ali stated, "Wars against the teachings of the Quran. I'm not trying to dodge the draft. We are not supposed to take part in no wars unless declared by Allah or the messenger. We don't take part in Christian wars or wars of any believers. He also said, we are not to be the aggressor, but will defend ourselves if attacked. He stated, man, I ain't got no quarrel with the Vietnam. And he elaborated, why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? And I kind of personally feel like where he was coming from is like, why not to go against, any veterans and not to go against, serving our country, because I have the utmost respect because I have veterans in my family. But from his standpoint of what he was standing for, not fighting a war that wasn't personally his or from his religious group, standing on his religious beliefs, because in this country we do have the First Amendment, which is, the freedom to practice our religion. And as for Native Americans, that gives us the freedom to practice our traditional ways.
Right.
Especially as sovereign nations, we get to have that luxury to create our own laws and everything, run our own reservations.
Right.
So with Muhammad Ali making that stand and standing on his principles, knowing he was going to face prison time, knowing that they was going to strip him of his titles, and it was a hard 4-year fight, I think, to get back into the ring. And he obtained his titles back after all the adversity. Like he said, he wasn't dodging the draft. He went and served his time.
Right.
And I just feel like that was a very commendable act in history and in time that needs to be celebrated and remembered, because as we move forward for these strides in life, for women fighting for their rights and so on and so forth, with us fighting for our indigenous rights, as far as, the ICWA thing y'all was talking about last week. I think that's just something that's very inspirational, that, he really stood on principles and he was who he was despite the public opinion, because he was really hated for his decision.
Yes.
Right.
I want to add on to that real quick too. I want to also acknowledge all of the Black soldiers that didn't get recognized for doing their heroic acts. And, sometimes it takes a very long time for those acts to even be talked about. And, we decorate our soldiers and, and sometimes, no, I shouldn't say sometimes. Most times, those Black soldiers do not get acknowledged until way later. And they may have not even been alive to receive the credit, or, I know it's not about credit, but to even be acknowledged. Yes, yeah.
Absolutely.
The honor of receiving deeds or their medals for their heroic acts in war.
Right. Which is a great point, because that's still something that happens to this day.
Absolutely.
Right. That's not just a part of history. Yeah. So as for mine, I have two, of course. I can never just decide on one. So the first name that came to my mind when I was writing down this icebreaker was Angela Davis. Miss Dr. Angela Davis. Phenomenal woman. I just admire her really from a point of activism, resiliency, and just that passion that she has, because Angela Davis is still alive. She was a part of the civil rights movement, and I think sometimes people don't realize that the civil rights movement was not that long ago. There
Absolutely.
are people who are still alive that were a part of that movement, who witnessed that movement. There's people who are still alive that went to schools that were segregated.
Absolutely.
That, seeing the process of desegregation and how ugly that was. One of the things that really strikes me with Angela Davis is she was not only involved, but she completely lived the lifestyle. As a young girl, she had one of her neighbors, and then her sister's friends were two of the 4 girls that were killed in the church bombing. Yeah. So it wasn't so much that the civil rights movement came along and here was this woman that just got involved, and she came into these spaces that were very masculine and, just was kind of a boss babe about it. No, she grew up with these experiences, as a young child living in fear of her home being bombed, or her father being murdered just for simply being Black. So I definitely idolize her. She's one of my idols. And then on the other end, my other like name that came to mind was Erykah Badu.
Yes.
I love Erykah Badu, not just from like a musical standpoint, but from a spiritual aspect. Erykah Badu definitely influences not even just the Black community, but the community who loves neo-soul music to get in touch with their roots, to understand that we are in charge of our energetic body, that we make our choices, that there are things out there that we can utilize to reground ourselves and to open our minds and change our perspectives on certain things. But she also will let you know that she might be spiritual and she might be grounded, but if she has to, she can step out of character and act up. And I just love that. She's just so raw and authentic.
Yes. Yeah. So to get into why we chose this topic, I think that it's important. Yes, we are Indigenous people, but also I think that it's important to talk about Black history in general and not just a month. I'm just gonna. Right. I have my opinion about like these months. Why do we? And then not only that, like why is Black History Month in February, which is like the shortest month out of the year? Like So
oppression.
It's just right. But regardless of whether it's this month or not, people should be talking about Black history in general.
Right, it's very important. Yeah, Black history is a part of American history, and the stuff that the Black community went through should not be forgotten, especially being that a lot of those historical experiences are still going on to this day. Mm-hmm.
So I want to open this up with this quote. And as I was researching and, just kind of educating myself on Black history in general, this nation was built on stolen land.
Yes.
And with sex and human trafficking.
Yes.
And a lot of the history that is taught in the public education systems do not even go into the full extent of what happened to the Black communities and also Indigenous communities too as well, because I feel like a lot of our social struggles and where we are at today, we've been oppressed by the same oppressor, but also the oppressed was also oppressed by other by the European monarchs, if you will.
Right.
And so we have all of this history and we don't ever really talk about it. And we have legislation here in Iowa and Nebraska that has banned critical race theory. Have you guys heard about what critical race theory is?
I haven't.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm so passionate about critical race theory.
Do you wanna tell everybody what critical race theory is in your own words?
Yeah, and then if I'm wrong, you can correct me.
Oh no, for sure, because it's a because we throw around critical race theory, but a lot of people don't know what critical race theory is. So yeah, right. So go ahead.
So from my understanding, critical race theory is the erasure of these historical components that make certain groups of people have like a sense of guilt or makes them feel bad about themselves. So we're talking about the civil rights movement. We're talking about the
Jim Crow laws,
mm-hmm. the genocide of Native Americans. We're talking about how Chinese immigrants were brought in to build the railroad structures. We're talking about women's suffrage. This is all stuff that these government systems would like to eliminate from history in a sense. So they want to take them out of like K through 12 school books and not have those discussions. I don't know as far as like on a college level goes, as far as like, public colleges and private colleges, if those public like universities or places would be taking it out. I would hope not, because I honestly, like, when I went to my 4-year university, that's where I learned everything. I didn't learn everything K through 12. And it was mind-blowing because I did 1 semester of world history, and then I did 2 semesters of American history, because after the first semester I was hooked. I was like, oh my gosh, this professor is amazing. He was so cute. He was like this little old tiny guy, and he was actually a professor at Iowa State the majority of his like collegiate career. But he was so raw, and he himself is like a member of like the Caucasian community. So to have that, and for him to be so brutally honest with these huge lecture halls about what happened was like amazing. I think after like my second lecture with him, I went up to him, I introduced myself as a Winnebago woman, and I thanked him for being as honest as he was. And then that's when I learned about his time at Iowa State, because he was like, oh, I know where that's at. And I was like, oh, you know where my little reservation is located on the map? I love that. But it's so important. So the removal of these history components to not make certain class members feel uncomfortable is just so unfortunate, because how do you talk about American history without talking about the genocides, the oppressions, the slave labor, slavery in general, and the conditions of that? That is an important piece of so much of our population in America. That's such an important component of their family structures, of their lives, like of what molded them into the culture that they are today, what molded these people into the person that they are, the way that their parents bring them up, and the stuff that they teach them. So
absolutely,
it's crazy.
So critical race theory, for folks that don't know, is basically it is a theory at the end of the day. However, it is addressing the social, political, and just how race plays into how our nation was built, and how the media, the entertainment, and how our world now operates. And so we have legislators from Nebraska, we have Iowa, we have South Dakota, all notoriously legislators that just always fight back on these issues. And it's really irritating, because this is part of American history. You cannot talk about, you can't leave out the indigenous and the Black community, the history components, because that is essentially how this nation was built. Now, just going to the U.S. Capitol, I just went to the U.S. Capitol about 2 months ago, and as beautiful as the U.S. Capitol is, and it's great, we have all these paintings and sculptures and all of this, but nobody really talks about how they were built. They used the Black community, the Black slaves, and they use them to create these big, massive structures. And then not only that, the walls are plastered with enslaved people, with indigenous folks being traumatized. And it's just like, you guys glorify these buildings and this, this painting, if you will, but we don't talk about the Black history component. We don't talk about the indigenous history component. We don't talk about the immigrant communities that also have been subjected to the same trauma and being oppressed. And we're supposed to sit here and say America's beautiful, America's the greatest, and we have a lot. So
we have a long way to go.
We have a lot. Yes, yeah, we do have a long way to go. And so in my research, I wanted to talk a little about the transatlantic slave trade. And I don't know if you guys know what that is. Are you familiar with it?
From my understanding, it's when the Europeans had touched down on Africa and basically purchased the slaves that they brought over to the North American continent.
Yeah, so the transatlantic slave trade was basically stemming from the papal bulls. And I don't know if you guys know what the papal bulls are. If not, the doctrine of discovery came from the papal bulls or was in the papal bulls. And it was the force behind this erasure of indigenous lands and the genocide of not only just the indigenous people, but the black people too as well. So we have the European monarchs that came to Africa, and even in that self, so there's a whole nother conversation in that with lateral oppression in the black community. So we had European monarchs that came to Africa, enslaved all of these black slaves, and then brought them over to not only just America, but Barbados, the Caribbean, and within that whole, that whole slave trade. We also had Native Americans too that were also bought and sold and shipped to the same areas.
Right.
So I think that we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the Afro-Indigenous component of Black history, if you will. So,
right.
Yeah, I just wanted to make mention of that because, again, a lot of the history doesn't talk about these things, and they do that for a reason. It's not like they don't know that, that this has happened. But why do we not talk about these things here in the public education system? Especially Iowa. Iowa always prided itself in being one of the best public education systems in the nation. And now, that's a whole nother can of worms to talk about. But
Right.
yeah.
Absolutely. I want to chime in a little bit. I feel like at the end of that conversation, it answered the question which you led with, which is why is it important to discuss Black history, especially for us indigenous people? Mm-hmm. For me personally, I feel like history that is forgotten is bound to repeat itself. And as you spoke on, Trish, with the foundation of this country and the foundation of America, it was built on the enslavement of one ethnicity. And it was also created by the attempted genocide of another. Mm-hmm. Those are just two facts, and that can't be rewritten nor forgotten because we still here.
Right.
So with that being said, I feel like this is very important to touch on and to discuss because it seems like you said going on with this theory of the critical race theory. I feel like we're being attacked, so to speak, and not even in a physical form, but spiritually.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All the time.
When we speak on enslavement today, slavery was abolished in the 1800s. Today, some of us, speaking from personal experience, are slaves to our own, say addiction, our own debt, our own pursuit of happiness. You know what I mean? Like I want to provide this good way of life for myself, but it's going to cost this much. So I got to go and trade my time for this monetary value. And in the end, I'm really giving up my dreams just so I can afford this way of life. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that take off since COVID because of the price of everything going up. And, we have to work more and we got to have 2 jobs. And this is my 3rd job. But, just saying like that is bound to repeat itself. I feel like we have to stand together, not just against any other ethnicity, but just against the degression itself, because it's all about progress today, moving forward, learning from the past mistakes and trying to build a better future for, all ethnicities, all religious groups, all types of people. I believe that was Dr. Martin Luther King's dream, was not just to free the segregated blacks, but it was also to have everybody sit down at the same table and live up to this nation's creed of equality. Right. So it's very important for us to discuss because, growing up, I never cared. Growing up, I didn't really understand the impact of what was going on being, a young Native American or a young Hispanic. But I read a quote once, on Facebook that said, "They came for the blacks and I did nothing because it wasn't my fight. They came for the LGBTQ and I stayed quiet because it wasn't my fight." They came for the Mexicans, and I stayed silent because it wasn't my fight. When they came for me, it was very silent because now that it is my fight, there is nobody left. And I kind of feel like,
dang,
you know, I feel like with that, it says it all. If we ignore other people's struggles, when it comes to ours, where's our help going to come from?
Right.
Ooh.
And so it's very, I mean, I can't explain why the months are broken down the way they are, but I'm going to just appreciate the fact that we get to take a moment to sit back and appreciate history. And we get to build off of that to create our own history. Because as we, all 3, 4, and 5, and everybody that's included in the making of this, we have an Indigified podcast run by Native Americans.
Right.
You know what I mean? Built off of just the history that we've studied and the people we've been inspired by.
Right.
So it's really important to pay homage and give that back. So I just wanted to chime in and throw that little bit of sauce onto your guys' meal that you've been, because sometimes I get caught up and I'm just listening and I'm like, man, they hitting the nail on the head, but I gotta throw my 2 cents in there because, you know. So with that, I want to turn it back over to you ladies for this Afro-Indigenous. School me on that. I couldn't even say it. What's that?
The Afro-Indigenous component, if you will. I don't know if component would be the term for that, but I think talking about Black history in the sense of like Native communities, or you know, because we have Black and Indigenous relatives,
Right.
And so I think I've seen this too, is like I've seen racism within our own Native communities when it comes to Black communities.
Oh, absolutely.
Or, you know, and I always wonder about that because I'm like, we are not that different. We're not that different.
Absolutely.
We are spiritual people. We have been oppressed by the same oppressor, and we are still being oppressed by the same oppressor. So I don't understand why that is even talked about, or like why that is even allowed within our own Native communities, especially with our Afro-Indigenous relatives. Again, just stating what I educated myself on was that New England colonies routinely shipped Native American slaves to the Barbados area, to Bermuda, Jamaica. So it's not that, you know, it's Afro-Indigenous relatives, you know, we're created, or, you know, I don't know if you guys heard about slave breeding farms. Yeah, so that is definitely a part of the American history, and if you don't know about that, you should definitely research it.
Dive into it.
Yes. So I think that just not to get too far off on a tangent here, but I don't understand why there is racism within our own Native communities towards our Black and Indigenous relatives, or just the Black community in general. But again, you know, it's this doctrine of discovery had dehumanized people of color since the beginning of colonization here in America. So I can understand it, but also I don't understand it at today, because it doesn't make any sense at all. We should be coming together and having these conversations and saying like, okay, the government still hates us and still is oppressing us. How are we going to change it? So yeah, that's just my little 2 cents. But Monica, if you want to dive into the Afro-Indigenous.
I will dive into it. So the Afro-Indigenous community is really important to not only speak about, but speak up for. So I feel like the Afro-Indigenous, or Black Native, Black Indigenous, there's a lot of different terms for it, right? I feel like it's so important to speak up for them because it's even more difficult for them to get their recognition than a person who is Native or a person who is Black. Both of those communities are so far oppressed that when you're mixing the two together, people tend to not recognize them as being from both cultures. They'll only recognize them from being from one culture, and generally it's the culture that they're raised by. So if they are raised, like in like urban cities, bigger areas, right, then the Black community will look at them as being Black. And if they're raised like here on our reservation homelands, or, you know, maybe even like in Sioux City, and they're around their Native American community, then they'll be recognized as being Native American. But very seldomly does anyone say, oh, you're Afro-Indigenous, because that is a culture. It's a culture. And there's a lot of people in North America that belong to that culture. And unfortunately, because of the way that history played out, there was a time where we had these ancestors or relatives, primarily like in the southern tribes and the tribes on the East Coast, that were assimilated into colonial culture. And there were, what is it called? So there was like a law, hold on, because I took notes, but I took notes on my phone.
Sure.
So there was the Dawes Act, and the Dawes Act targeted the, what did they call them? The 5 civilized tribes. That's what they called them. So it was the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles. That's who was identified as the civilized tribes, right?
How you gotta be civilized? Like, I don't get that.
So when I was reading it, right, I was like, well, that was a very colonial word to use, civilized, you know, because the rest of us were called savages. But so I feel like those tribes were identified as the civilized tribes because if you think of their placement, they were the ones that, you know, first, I can't say first, but were of the first tribes that came in contact with colonial settlers. And they're also larger tribes, you know, whereas smaller tribes may have went through a complete genocide of that community, or maybe they went through like those genocidal experiences, and whoever survived would end up, you know, moving and traveling until they came across another tribe that would be willing to like adopt them in, right? So long as they took up with their cultures, learned their language. But anyway, so with the Dawes Act, the government offered these tribes land allotments if they gave up their tribal governments, and they followed state and federal laws and regulations, but they also had to dress like the colonial people dressed. They had to farm, and the crops that they grew had to be available not just to the tribal community. So there was like these, what's the word I'm looking for? Stipulations. There was these stipulations to the Dawes Act, and that's also where our registry of Native Americans, when people are trying to reconnect with their history, that's where people are finding their ancestors. They're on the Dawes Act. It has their blood quantum. That's where blood quantum comes in at, is tracking our, you know, how much of our lineage, how much of a percent we are of Native. And so with this, there were Native American people who would essentially become wealthy because of their farming and the crops that were being sold to the government. A lot of those people had slaves as well. There's people in our lineage that had slaves as well. And, you know, I can't say the treatment of these slaves were great, or the treatment of these slaves were just as terrible as it was on these colonial plantations. But with that, there ended up becoming an Afro-Indigenous community. You had these two cultures together, and, you know, we're all adults. One thing leads to another, and there's babies. But also outside of the component of Native American people having slaves, there was also the freedmen who would seek out, you know, or runaway slaves who would essentially come into these reservation lands, and our people would be welcoming of them. And then they became a part of our communities. And that leads to the Afro-Indigenous community as well. And it's so important to recognize these people. But going back to the Dawes Act, when I think it was like, what did I read? I want to say it was like 100,000 people that it was something like that. If that's like way off, my bad. But I believe it was like 100,000 people or 500, I don't know. But it was this large amount of people that put in an application for the Dawes Act. But it was a very, very, very small percentage of those people that were actually approved. And a big part of that was the Afro-Indigenous community. Their applications were not being approved because you were only allowed to be from one race. And if you're putting down Native American, but you have African, why can't I think of the words that I'm like, features? If you have African features that are noticeable, these people that were building these structures for us people of color, they weren't going to be like, oh yeah, well, you're part Native, here's a land allotment. No, they didn't want to give us the land as it was. It was just like
They
a
still
tool.
don't want to give us the land back.
Yeah, it was just a tool of assimilation. So, you know, from their point of view, why would they give land allotments to these mixed race people, especially if they didn't appear to be Native American? So,
Yes.
I feel like I went off for a really long time, but
No,
It's
you-
all good.
I be deep diving
You
into
did a
this
lot
stuff,
of
y'all.
good, a lot of good things. I can relate to that last part you were saying of being, because I am of two mixed ethnicities.
Right.
My dad is from Mexico, and my mother is a enrolled member of the Omaha tribe. And for us, from my understanding, going into the 5 civilized tribes, like
It makes me cringe
Some-
every time. I'm like,
some
oh my
tribes did not resist,
God. Right.
nor did they attack. And the Omaha tribe was one of them, documented as one of the tribes that came in contact with the Lewis and Clark expedition. And we have a documented history of adopting other settlers into our tribe, as we have the first Native American doctor whose last name is, I think, initially
La
French.
Flèche.
Yeah, it's a French last name.
Dr.
Get it, girl.
So,
Susan
touching on that, like the Omaha way, we believe is not blood quantum. From my understanding, from the books I've read, it wasn't about blood quantum, or it was more of, it was a way of life. How you adapt to it and how you accept it, and if you speak the language and you live the way, then you are
Yes,
Omaha.
being a member of the community.
Yes. So
Yes.
as you guys were saying, some of these runaways and these freedmen and other settlers that came in, like from my understanding, my tribe was very accepting, and that's kind of how we grew. Because as you guys are speaking, I'm thinking of my family, and personally for me, I have on my Hastings side, we're full-blooded, and we have some family who are half black, and then now a quarter Omaha, and there it just the math goes down and down and down. But I don't necessarily look at them as any less Native than myself, because I'm split down the middle, 50-50, and so yeah, I think it's very important to acknowledge all people. Just saying, as indigenous people, we acknowledge the 4-legged, the 2-legged, the flyers, the
Right.
swimmers, like to acknowledge everybody, and especially those that are of less percentage. But if your mother, grandmother, grandparent, if your lineage tracks back to an indigenous tribe, embrace that.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Own that, but at the same time, embrace your other side. Because for me, I can't be racist. I come from two splits, so like I can't really pick one or the other.
Right.
I choose to embrace both. I'm learning Spanish, and while going to NICC to obtain my certificate and my degree, I'm learning the Omaha language. And English is my first spoken language, so I'm becoming a trilingual individual. And it's very hard.
Yeah.
Not easy, but so just going with that conversation, like I said, you just touched a lot of good points, and you gave us a really good history lesson that I wasn't aware of personally. And like I said, these are some of the conversations that a lot of people don't want to talk about.
Right.
And as far as the question of why we segregate and why we act a certain way towards, you know,
why
non-full,
we have like a division.
It's going on to answer that question. From my understanding and my personal belief is like, it's a top behavior. You know what I mean? The settlers came here and savage, pow pow. You know, and then they pointed over here and put the handcuffs on to enslave, you know. And so also I doubt any kind of treatment of slavery was very fond or nice. Just saying, like,
but there's those stories that are out there that were like, yeah, well, they had slaves, but you know, they weren't like, and I'm just like, well, they still had slaves.
To my understanding, any forced you know, the consent it means no, any forced thing, like they were forced into this life of, you know, just
they were trafficked. That's exactly what it is.
And so I don't think there is a nice way to put it of like any group that owned another race, you know, obviously was wrong because it's no longer tolerated today by law. So
and you cannot own a person.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You do not own them.
Absolutely. So yeah, just getting into all that stuff is really, really good food for thought. So I thank you ladies for bringing up the topics and your opinions to the table.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot more to dive into. So, you know, not only just for yourself, but for any of our listeners, if this is something where you were like, oh, I didn't know that, take that and learn. You know, don't have those, oh, I didn't know that moments and then just go on with your life. No, get to know it. Get to know it, because you know, going back to critical race theory, if they're not going to be teaching our children and our future generations about what actually happened, it's our responsibility to do that. And it's important for us to know about it, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes anyone feel. It is what happened. We need to talk about it. If we can still talk about the Holocaust, the genocide that happened in another country, then we should be able to talk about the genocides and the oppressions that happened in our own country in the past and current.
Amen. No,
Absolutely.
I said that. No. I do want to talk about lateral oppression. So Brandon and I had this conversation about just somebody that he works with, no names or anything, but that there is lateral oppression within the Black community and also the Indigenous community. And again, I think it stems from, you know, just this government or, you know, just from colonization itself.
Societal standards.
Yeah. So, and I have talked to Semhar, who is the Sioux City's inclusive director, about, you know, things that she experiences too as well. So like in the Indigenous community, we have lateral oppression, right? That's it's there. Nobody can deny that it's not there. It's there. So I thought it was interesting when Semhar had also said, like, yeah, that happens to us. And I was like, what, really? And she was talking about, you know, like, so she's Ethiopian, but she grew up here in the States and, you know, goes to college, or has gone to college, but that she has experienced lateral oppression in her own community. And I just thought that was, I don't know why, I have no idea why that was just so, like, mind-blowing to me, but that it does happen. So I don't know. I guess, again, just kind of going back to the conversation of like why it's important to talk about the Black history and what all happened with the Black community, and you know, just having the responsibility and the obligation of learning that history, because again, what Brandon had said was just so spot on, because we need to start showing up for the Black community. The Black community needs to start showing up for us, and, you know, like, we just need to come together. But yes, there is different dynamics, and it is challenging at times, because it's not about the oppression Olympics, so to speak. Like, we've all been oppressed, and you know, I don't know. I feel like sometimes our Native communities just doesn't care enough, or they just turn a blind eye to it, and it's infuriating because it's like, oh, like, why do you not care about, the Black community or the Asian community or just your own community? Like, so I guess I'm just kind of venting in a way.
Which is okay. It's a good vent, because at the end of the day, though we come from these different classifications of race and we have these different cultures, at the end of the day, we're also put into one group. Society calls us minorities, but with the way our generation, the past generations, and our future generations are modernized things, we're the BIPOC community. Mm-hmm. We're the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community. We make up this huge population of people who have been systemically oppressed. And it's important for us to have these tough conversations and to show up for one another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I don't know if you guys want to talk about maybe like the civil rights movement, women's suffrage. Is there anything that is just pressing that you guys want to talk about?
Well, I'm not really too sure for women's suffrage, but I did mention earlier that I wanted to just give little historical facts, as we are celebrating Black History Month, because I'm sitting here with some very powerful and strong-minded women. This is somebody that I feel, I lost it now. Here we go. This is somebody I feel had a very strong, a very strong place in history, and I'm just lost her name. Give me a second to pull it up.
Well, while you look for that, I guess one last thing I would like to say is to people who do not belong to the Black or African American culture, stop using the N-word.
Oh, yes.
It is
not.
It is not cute, and it does not belong to you to utilize in whatever manner you want. Now, to the people who have taken that oppressive word and have began utilizing it in a way that gives them their power back, what you do with it, you do with it. But as for us who were never exposed to being called that term, stop using it. Yeah. Go wash your mouth out with soap.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yep.
Shirley Chisholm was the name. And this little fun fact is Congress is more diverse now than it's ever been. However, when Chisholm was attempting to shatter the glass ceiling, the same couldn't be said. During the racially contentious period in the late 60s, she became the first Black woman elected to Congress. She represented New York's 12th district from 1969 to 1983, and in 1972, she became the first woman to run for Democratic Party's presidential nomination. Her campaign slogan, "Unbought and Unbossed," rings even louder today. Senator and now Vice President Kamala Harris paid tribute to Chisholm in her 2020 presidential campaign announcement by using a similar logo to Chisholm's. Mm-hmm. And I kind of feel like that's just something to end on a good note for everybody, that's why history is so important, because as of today, we have our first not only woman, but our first Black woman vice president. Yes. And I feel like soon you guys might be able to get a female into the White House. You know what I mean? So let's keep striving. Let's keep striving towards creating history, not only just for our ethnicity, but for human beings in general.
Yes.
So, is there any closing remarks you ladies want to share with us?
I think what I want to close with is just learn the Black history and talk about it. We all have an obligation and responsibility to learn the history, and the legislators can do what they want, but that knowledge is out there, and why not? It's free and it's out there, so learn it.
Yes.
And then have conversations about it.
Yes.
Bring it up.
Yes. So next week we'll be talking about chasing dreams, what that means to us. I guess share some of our stories of some dreams we've chased, because not every dream you chase is going to be successful. So tune in next week to hear us talk about that. And don't forget to be a good human.
Yes. Just to big announcement, we have hit our 100 download mark, and it has only been the 3 episodes so far.
Absolutely.
So I just want to say thank you to everybody that has tuned in.
Yes,
if you haven't,
thank
you can look us up on Spotify. You can look us up on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio. We're also on YouTube. So please make sure to click the download button and the notification bell. Also, we do have a new TikTok. I just made a new TikTok, so you can find us at Indigified Podcast. And then if you have any suggestions for topics, maybe you want to comment on something, you can also contact us at indigifiedpodcast@gmail.com. And as always, I just want to mention Great Plains Action Society, a nonprofit-led or indigenous-led nonprofit organization who does a lot of work here in Iowa, Nebraska, and we are just so thrilled to be able to be a sponsor of this podcast. We are looking for more sponsors too as well. So if you are interested in being a sponsor where we can plug in your services or maybe have you come on and speak a bit about who you are and what you do, we would love that. We welcome that. So
Right.
With that, I'll turn it back over to Monica.
Oh, I was just going to say that as we're recording this live and broadcasting on the radio station, that we're also on Winnebago the Big Voices Facebook page live. Mm-hmm. And so when we're conversating, if you as listeners would like to engage with us, you can go to that Facebook page and you can comment. We'll try our best to keep up with the comments because as you can tell, we really get lost in our conversations with one another. But I think that would just be a great way to engage with our listeners and our viewers. So
absolutely. And I'd like to thank everybody for watching. Thanks for supporting, and thanks for just giving us the good energy that we need to keep this thing going, man. With that being said, stay blessed.
Have a beautiful weekend.